Hey, how you
Hey,
doing?
I'm good. Oh, let me do one thing here. Let me just mute this so that I don't have any feedback.
Yeah.
Perfect. Giddy up. All right, perfect. I'm doing well. So how are you?
Great. I'm doing fantastic.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm excited about our conversation here tonight,
Hmm.
and I'm looking forward to what we're going to discuss, and hopefully people will get. Well, I know that they're going to get some good information out of this. But
Hmm.
anyway, so Jared, first of all, before we get started, let everybody know who Jared Foote is and what is it that you do.
Right. So yeah, I am a certified personal trainer. I am a certified yoga teacher, an animal flow instructor, and a mindfulness-based stress reduction coach. Um, I offer a variety of different services, one-to-one coaching, of course, online and in person. I do virtual and in-person group classes, as well as I have an on-demand subscription service and on-demand training library. So those are my main services. I have a broad background. So I actually started as a technology consultant and kind of went through this crazy journey. It's a period of my life where I realized I wanted to change up my career path and ended up deciding I wanted to coach. I had this deep passion for health and wellness and this just like deep drive to give back and want to help people. And that journey took me through some traveling, a lot through Southeast Asia. That's where I did a lot of my certifications, and started coaching and teaching at some gyms in Thailand and abroad in some other places as well. And I've been home back in the Toronto, Canada area for the last little while through, all this craziness with COVID and whatnot, and just training and working with my clients online and in person here. So that's a little bit about me. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, um, that lets us know a little bit about what has been part of your past. But
Hmm.
let me ask you specifically.
Yeah.
So, why did you begin training in movement skills and
Mm.
body weight training?
Yeah. So for myself personally, I've always been a fitness enthusiast, a wellness enthusiast. From a more physical side of things, I loved lifting weights. I started lifting weights when I was really young. My dad taught me in the basement when I was like 12 years old. I started bench pressing and deadlifting and stuff. And I got really strong. I was actually a fair amount bigger. Maybe my shoulders would have taken more space on the screen back in my university college days. I was stronger, but I was wicked tight. I started developing hip issues from like just using improper form and stuff after years of just heavy lifting without balancing it out with other kinds of training. Um, that was part of what led me to yoga, which just opened this whole doorway into just generalist movement training. I'm a big fan of guys like Eo Portal. I'm very, very inspired by generalists overall. And so I kind of decided to take a similar route. More recently, I'm in love with Animal Flow. It's just an incredible system that I practice a lot. Um, and that's more from the physical side. That's kind of how I got to where I am now. From the mental side of things as well, a lot of struggles with anxiety in my earlier years, and kind of getting into more of my college years as well led me to mindfulness and meditation. And those two things were very separate for me for a long time.
Mhm.
I had my physical practice and I had my mental practice. And when I came to yoga and just came to movement in general, really, is when I started to realize that those two puzzle pieces actually fit together extremely well. And so my coaching method, as well as my personal practice, is one that very much meshes together movement, mindfulness, and lifestyle practices. Yeah.
Well, so we spoke a little bit before we started the interview, and I had talked to you about one of the posts that you had made, which
Mm.
showed your progression over time,
Hmm.
and certainly the level of skill that you have now is I think most people would agree quite high,
Mm.
and compared to where you started, it's quite a bit more advanced.
Hmm.
My question here is, what was your background before you started training in movement skills? Apart from strength training with your dad,
Mm.
did you have any particular skills
Mm.
in what you do now as a movement specialist?
I had acquired some basic understanding of, athleticism and some movement patterns from playing some sports. I played hockey. I was an ice hockey goalie, and I played rugby and American football when I was in high school and a little bit in university. So I picked up some basics of athleticism from there, and I've been a physical person most of my whole life, but no, I really didn't have any. Now, based on what I know now, I really had almost nothing when I first started out. And it really was and still is just, it just completely overwhelms me more and more every day how large a sphere movement becomes and how much there is to learn. No, I really didn't have much coming into it. I would say I'm mostly self-taught. I've had some great teachers along the way, but none really very long-term. Um, I think that post that you mentioned, that handstand post, yeah, it really was just determination and just sheer will to learn and to try and to fall over and over and over again that has taught me hand balancing, as well as many other movement skills as well.
Well, I think it's interesting that, one of the last things you said there, that it's, well, two things. So number one, that this is a group of skills that there is no end to it, because when you learn a skill, that is just something that opens up a door to other skills.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's particularly interesting, cool. And the other thing that I think is important about that is just that the whole idea of devoting time and patience to this thing that keeps knocking you down. And it's not that it's knocking you down in a dejection sort of way. It's just that, you think, oh, I'm ready for this. I got this. Oh, no, you're not. It's like,
yeah.
So there's always, it's not, yes, you can do a certain skill, but there is always a more advanced version, and there is always a practice to the skill, right? Because you never truly mastered it, right? You can get better at it, you can make it look more pretty, but even then, and I had this conversation with Miguel Santana a little while ago, you can always make it look better, right? And they go, oh, today my line wasn't this correct. Oh, I didn't feel that great. So I think that is one of the interesting things about that. And it really ties into the mental aspect, because you have to let your ego go a little bit.
For sure. Absolutely. I totally agree. There's no such thing as true perfection. There's just progress. And a guy like Miguel I've followed him for a while. I don't know him personally, but you look at his practice from the outside, or somebody who's not, really tried a lot of hand balancing before, you might look at a guy like that, or even a guy like myself, and think like, that looks like perfection. But once you're in it, and once you've been doing that kind of stuff, it's like, no. The details just become increasingly more important. And there's, like you said, there's just always more room to grow, more practices to expand into, to connect together. And that's why it's so much fun. That's why it's so interesting to me. Weights got boring after a little while, as much as I still do love them and practice them. There's obviously lots of room for growth there as well. It's just when you start to broaden your horizons and start to connect different practices together that sometimes don't seem like they fit together that well. You find unique combinations, you find a unique practice for yourself, as well as something unique to share with other people too. Yeah.
Now, so your Instagram handle is Evolve with Jared.
Yes.
So tell me now, how has your training evolved over time?
How has my training evolved over time? In many ways, that word has some pretty deep philosophical implications to me, the evolve, evolution, that kind of thing. So, from a physical perspective, you could probably see it going through my Instagram page a little bit. It has definitely evolved in the sense that I have moved very much away from basic movement patterns towards complexity. I really like the idea of starting with isolation to integration to improvisation, and I'm starting to get into a lot of these more integration and improvisation phases now. That's a movement philosophy I believe comes from Ido Portal, so I just want to give some credit there. But I really do believe in isolating things and then integrating them together and then improvising. So I've gone from weightlifting to yoga to calisthenics and sort of gymnastics style to animal flow. I've started mixing a bit of capoeira and breakdancing in there, and I'm actually on my way towards dance. Actually, I love the idea of contemporary dance and actually lots of different forms of dance, and just the idea that I want to learn as many movement patterns as I possibly can in a lifetime. And that to me is another thing that I think I could connect that is going to teach me just tons of new movement patterns and how to integrate them and improvise them in unique ways. So from a physical perspective and what you would see me doing visually, that's how it's evolved and how it will continue to evolve. I think I'll probably put some kind of a boundary around things so that I think already I have a unique take from a physical side with the animal flow, yoga, calisthenics stuff. From a more mental perspective, I've evolved very much away from, aesthetics and sort of an ego-driven practice towards one that is much more spiritual. I know not everybody likes that word very much. I actually consider myself a very science-based person, but spirit to me, actually, if you look into the meaning of the word, all that really means is to breathe. Or that the Latin origin of the word. So I've moved away from what I originally started my practice. The goals of my practice were originally to look good and of course to feel good and get strong and just be a beast, which I still love those things. They're great byproducts of the practice, but I am now evolving and moving towards a much more spiritually driven practice. I'm just astounded at what the human body can do, whether it's my own or anyone else's. And I just want to continuously learn more about what this body can do, what this mind can do, and the relationship between those two things.
Cool. Yeah. I really like the idea of breaking things down into their components and then bringing them back together and mixing them into some kind of complex form. And, one of the principles that we talk about at Human 2.0, and I talk about this with my patients, is I have a philosophy that movement is a language, okay? Just the same way you would learn English, you would learn Russian. And right now, most of us don't really understand how to speak the language of movement very well. And so I like the idea of you breaking it down into the patterns, because to me, those individual patterns and movements, they are like the syllables and the words of the language of movement. And so instead of us right now, basically we say, oh, play hockey, do this, do that. And that's like saying to somebody, hey, never spoke Russian before, speak Russian. Right? And it's like, no wonder they sound unintelligible because they don't know Russian. But when you learn these individual skills, you learn these individual patterns, now you learn these individual consonants, vowels, and the words of the language. And when you look at somebody like Michael Jordan play basketball, somebody like, Wayne Gretzky play hockey, you go, oh my God, they're speaking hockey, they're speaking basketball at the highest level, right? Gotcha. And so what I like about what you're doing is that it's like as if you're going back to grade school. You're learning the words, learning the consonants, learning the vowels, and then boom, the complexity is you speaking movement at a higher level. And when you look at Ido, you go, oh yeah, that dude is like Shakespeare in the movement world. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so that's something that we can all aspire to. So I like the idea of breaking it down like that and then bringing it back. All right.
Fantastic.
So let me ask you the next question now.
Yeah.
So when you started first, you mentioned a little bit about your dad showing you stuff, but when you started your personal movement journey, was that completely by yourself, or did you have any kind of guidance? And if you were guided initially, by whom?
Yeah, I did have a tad bit of guidance, but largely by myself. I guess, yeah, it's funny. I never really thought about him that way, but I suppose my father was my first movement coach. In a way, I mean, probably wouldn't call him a movement coach so much as like a personal trainer of sorts, because we were doing so much weightlifting, and he's kind of the old school bodybuilder type guy. And that's what I first learned to do. But I guess he was certainly my first coach in that sense. And, moving away from that, I'm actually still very competitive with him too, which I love. And he's still a very fit guy in his older age now, and he still crushes it with weights. But I've actually sort of, I guess, inspired him to try some new things. But moving on into my later practice, I've had some great yoga teachers in my life. So when I did my yoga teacher training in India, I had a very traditional training. I studied Hatha and Ashtanga yoga, and I had a fantastic Hatha teacher and I had a fantastic Ashtanga teacher. Absolutely fantastic people, and just so caring, and really inspired me not only as a yogi but as a coach. After that, I worked with some fellow trainers in Thailand, which I learned a lot from, but it was kind of a mutual coaching experience and that kind of thing. I think everybody you come across, whatever stage of the journey that they're in, there's always something to learn from everybody, whether they're much more advanced than you or less advanced than you. And, whatever context we're talking about advancement there. So I think in a sense, I've had many, many, many coaches, but officially, no, not really. I think the longest I've ever spent being coached or taught by one individual person was about a month while doing my yoga teacher training in India. But apart from that, probably not. I have had some friends who've taught me a lot about hand balancing, some friends that live near me. There's some great calisthenics facilities
Well, I
here.
suppose it,
Mhm.
I suppose
Can you hear me?
Calisthenics facilities here.
Well, I suppose if you're going to, you're kind of cutting in and out. So I wasn't sure if you were finished there, but I was going to say that if you're going to learn yoga and you're going to be taught by anybody, it's probably a good idea to be taught in India. That's what I would say.
They're tough out there. Yeah.
Yeah. Go to the source.
Yeah, and it really was the source. I was in Rishikesh in India, which is the home of yoga, they call it. Incredible place.
Okay. Now, so here's a question, and we've skirted around this a little bit, but I want to get more specific. So,
for sure.
I want to know what length of time and what amount of practice, if you had to estimate number of hours and stuff like that, was required, not necessarily to get to where you are today, but to get to a level where you would say you have a relatively high level of proficiency with yoga or movement skills. What amount of time, what length of time was required?
I've been very dedicated and consistent with my movement practice. And by movement, I mean, more towards the body weight style of training, equipmentless. I'd certainly started with yoga, but I've been very consistent and dedicated to my practice of movement for a little over 2 years now. I certainly had a good head start because I had great strength, and I also had a bit of mobility, reasonable amount of flexibility from playing some sports. But 2.5 years, I would say, to get to where I am. Now, when it comes to frequency, durations, when it comes to actual training sessions themselves, I would say I practice anywhere between 5 and 7 days a week. I occasionally will do multiple sessions. I believe in very high frequency, lower intensity training. And I believe in moving as often as possible while understanding that rest is absolutely, absolutely so critical. So I rest lots. I sleep lots. If I am sore, well, sometimes a certain muscle group's sore and you can work around it a little bit. But, if I listen very closely to my body and I know when the time is right to train and when it's not, I do train largely intuitively. I write myself programs and I stick to them with a reasonable degree of flexibility. My sessions themselves range from 20 minutes to 2 hours. They've been longer. But I really do believe that it is just consistency and frequency over long durations of time that's really the most important. I think a lot of people have these questions of like, well, should I do 30 minutes or should I do an hour and a half? Or, should I train twice a day or should I train 3 times a week? It's like, well, you know what? Make sure you're training regularly. Find something that you really love so it doesn't feel like a chore. Find something that you're interested in that feels good and do it regularly. I also don't like this idea. I work with a lot of people who wake up the next morning and they're like, well, I'm not really sore, so I didn't do anything. It's like, well, you got to get rid of that mindset. You got to get rid of that mindset. Cause maybe soreness in some cases is an indicator that, you tore some muscle fibers and they're rebuilding stronger or longer or whatever it is. But it's certainly not always the case that you didn't do any work just because you don't feel some soreness. I usually try not to be too sore, because if you're too sore, then you can't train, and you want to keep going frequently. You want a sustainable long-term practice. And so, that's a little bit in terms of it's high frequency, low intensity, be consistent, train as often as you can while getting in the rest you need. That's how I would summarize that whole thing there.
For sure. And I don't know if do you follow any mixed martial arts at all?
A little bit. Yeah. I have some good friends who are BJJ teachers.
Okay.
It seems very interesting. I would love to try it, but haven't yet.
All right. Well, I just mentioned that because I saw an interview a while ago with Firas Zahabi and Joe Rogan. So Firas Zahabi he was George St. Pierre's trainer, and he's based out of TriStar. I think it's called TriStar in Montreal. And he was on there, and he had an interesting statement, which kind of echoes what you said there. And he said he does not believe at all, 100%, in being sore. And the reason why is this, because he said, if you look at the volume of work that somebody who is never sore can do, because they can train every single day, right? Every single day they can train, not having a problem because they are never sore. So he said over time, the amount of work that the person who trains and who is never sore, what they can do, because they can train every single day, as opposed to the person who's got like, I got to feel it. I got to feel the burn. I got to feel it. And I got to know that I did something. He said, in the short term, the person who goes hard is going to win. Right. But in the long term, the person who's never sore is going to do more work. So and who do you want to be? Do you want to be the guy who's doing more work, has more exposure to the skill, and has more opportunities to develop the skill? Yeah. Than the guy who's going hard, killing himself, but then's got to take 3 days to rest, right? I thought that was a very interesting insight, right? And I'm old school muscle head, I'm gym rat, and it's hard to train my brain to not want to do that, right? And I was always, I gotta feel the burn, man. I gotta feel sore the next day to know I did something. So I thought that was quite interesting. And I always enjoy, even though I don't ascribe to CrossFit, one thing I liked about it was the amount of work that they could put under the curve, right?
Incredible.
But after I heard Firas Zahabi, I'm like, they can maybe do a lot of work in a session, but over time, they're going to lose out.
Oh, absolutely. And I think a lot of this comes back on the CrossFit point of view, actually, because I find myself having this conversation regularly now. I love watching CrossFit. I've tried it a few times. I'd love to get better at it, but it's something I don't tend to focus on for exactly the reasons you were just mentioning. I think CrossFit athletes are athletes. You look at a lot of different athletes, like they beat the crap out of their body over the length of their career, right? And smart athletes know exactly what they're doing. Obviously you get stronger, faster, better, but if you're talking about longevity and long-term health and a sustainable movement practice, an athlete isn't necessarily somebody you want to idolize. And CrossFit athletes are probably the most extreme forms of, well, maybe there's others, but they're one of the most extreme forms of athletes out there. Insanely impressive. I cannot believe what these people can do. But if your goal isn't to compete and win and be a top tier elite athlete, maybe CrossFit isn't necessarily the right thing to be doing super frequently and super intensely and all that. It's fun. It's a great workout. You burn a ton of calories. You will get super strong. And it's super impressive. But this is the kind of stuff where, coming back to the idea I was sharing earlier and sort of how my practice has evolved and also how I coach too is, unless somebody has a specific reason why they want to do those things, or that they do want to compete and lift weights, or, they want to be like a bodybuilding competitor or a power lifter or a CrossFitter or something like that, I tend to gently steer people away from doing it super intensely, super high frequency, and just doing it for the sake of enjoyment and fun. And to me, it's this thing that most of us end up doing as we begin our journeys, where it's like, I want my six pack in 30 days. I want my pecs in 30 days. I want to shed this much weight in 30 days. And it's a quick solution that we look for initially, only to lead us to a longer journey that's it's less ego based and a bit more sort of spiritual and truly like well-being based, as you get deeper into the practice. At least that's what I've found. Unless, of course, there are the exceptions of athletes and whatnot. So that's just my take on that stuff. I love it. It's so impressive. I love watching it. It's so cool. And it's a lot of fun. But I think if what you're going after is just longevity, you can do it without weights. You can do it anywhere, really. So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting, one of my previous guests is Matt Wenning, who's like 3 times world champion powerlifter, and he's a strength coach. And one of the things that he said is, even for him, okay, even though he is a powerlifter and that dude is a beast, he was said, everybody trains for bigger, faster, stronger. Everybody does that, and there's lots of people that do that well. But if you are not training for longevity, right? He said, what is the point, man? He said, do you want to not be able to move when you are older, right?
Absolutely.
So it's like, why burn yourself into the ground and then not prepare yourself for later life, right? Because you're not going to be a CrossFit athlete forever, or whatever your sport or your skill, whatever it is, you're not going to be that forever, right? So if you would like to be able to move and be generally fit, flexible, and strong later on, you have to prepare yourself for that. You need to train with longevity in mind.
For sure.
Okay. So let's segue from that. That's a good time. So tell me now, do you feel that your movement practice prepares you for injury prevention? If so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes back to range of motion and controlling yourself in different ranges of motion. So, early in my practice, I went from super strong to like super flexible really quickly. And I very quickly learned the ups and downs to both of those things, to, being super stable and strong, but in but in limited ranges of motion. And then having huge ranges of motion, but being not stable in them at all. And now my practice is about finding as close to perfect a balance as I can find between those two things, stability and mobility, really. And yes, absolutely, I do believe that movement practice is one of the best ways to prehabilitize. I'm not sure if that's the correct term, but I'm sure everyone knows what I mean by that, is to prevent injuries in the future, prevent injuries in the long term. And ultimately what you want to be doing in order to do that is to mobilize yourself so that you have very broad ranges of motion. but also stabilize yourself so that even in extreme ranges of motion, you have control and strength. That is what my practice is all about. I really believe that that's kind of the heart of movement practice in and of itself is functional ranges of motion. And ultimately, like if I was to summarize the entire practice of movement, it would just be teaching your body to control as many different patterns as possible in as broad a range of motion as possible in each of those patterns, and then do that fast and do that slow. Actually start with slow and then go fast. So it's about speed and control. It's about range of motion, and it's about stability, basically. And it's just the more things you can do with your body, the more directions and positions you can put it in, and control that's ultimately what's going to get you longevity, right? That's what's going to keep you physically healthy for the long term. So anything beyond that, there's so many different techniques and ways to do that, of course, but anything beyond that, you know, if you're building muscle just for the sake of building muscle, or just getting super flexible for the sake of getting super flexible, like it might be fun. There will be some health benefits from it, but it's just not as complete a practice as you would want it to be if you really are shooting for longevity and long-term health and wellness.
Well, it's interesting. You know, I think of movement skills, movement training, and rehabilitation and prehabilitation as being, they're all the same thing. They're just on a continuum, right?
Yep.
And I constantly say to my post-operative patients, first, you know, when I talk to them about rehabilitation and the goals that I have for them with physiotherapists, I tell them, look, first thing we need to do is obtain your range of motion. Each joint has a range of motion, and I don't want you to learn or to develop part of it. I want you to develop the whole thing. So there we're talking about the flexibility. Then I tell them, then the next thing that we need to do is to restore the strength, which is going to give you the ability to control your range of, or control your body's movement through that range of motion.
Right, yeah.
We need to drain your mobility, which is a demonstration of strength throughout the whole range of motion, not just one part, a little part, or at one spot, but the whole range of motion. Then after that, you need to demonstrate your ability to own that range of motion, or to go through that range of motion with control and precision. So flexibility, strength, mobility, and then own it, right?
Yeah.
And so you can do those things for a in a rehabilitation setting, and so the demands are low. But then you can do them and apply them to sports or to other skills, and the demand comes higher. And then you can become like a movement specialist, where you're doing it at the highest degree, right?
For sure.
But to me, it's all the same thing, and it's all along a continuum, right? And the approach doesn't change whether I'm doing it with somebody who's post-operative rehab and injured, or whether I'm doing it with somebody who is a movement specialist. They're all doing the same thing, but they're just doing it at different levels and different progressions.
Right, yeah. I really like that layered approach you've got, and that's a very systematic way to look at it. That's great. And definitely, you know, I think a lot of people have probably heard the idea that you want to mobilize flexibility and then move through those layers you were just talking about. But it's much easier to layer strength on top of mobility than to go the opposite way, to have a lot of strength and then somehow maintain that strength as you get super flexible. It just doesn't really work that way. I learned that the hard way, because I got super strong and then lost a ton of it as I got crazy flexible. And then I started layering mobility and stability on there, and now I'm starting to get back to the levels of strength that I used to have. But I had to take that huge step backwards first to get flexible, to get those ranges of motion. And I built lots of skills along the way, but I'm still not quite at the level of strength that I was. So I wish I knew that layered approach that you just outlined much, much earlier in my practice, so that I could have taken that approach and had a lot of fun with it along the way too, because I think I would have had a lot of fun with it in my early days.
Exactly. And you know, it's so for myself, it's a little bit of a personal pet peeve when, you know, if I can have patients rehabilitate at our facility with our therapists who understand the way that I think, then great. But not everybody does, so that's fine. But it's a
Right.
personal pet peeve of mine when I speak to patients when they come back and I see, oh, they don't have a full range of motion, they have some kind of deficit. And I ask them, well, what have you guys been doing? And they say, oh, well, we've been doing all these strength training exercises and working with bands. And I'm like, but you don't have a full range of motion. Your shoulder only goes to here. Why would you put strength on top of that?
Yeah.
First things comes first, man.
Yeah.
Get the range of motion first. Get it passively, then get it actively. Add strength on top of that. Because as you said, I've seen this from experience, right? That if you add in strength prematurely, your flexibility, people get used to that, using that range of motion. Oh, I don't need this extra little bit. And then they compensate with other things. Get the flexibility first, full range of motion. If you have a full range of motion for a reason, use it, right?
Yeah.
Get the full range of motion, then add the strength on top of that.
Love it.
So, but that's just my personal pet peeve.
A little bit of mine too.
Okay.
I can hear that.
So, let me ask you now. Sorry?
Oh, I said I could hear a bit of the pet peeve coming out in your voice as you were explaining that, but I love it and I totally agree. Yeah.
Listen, man. One thing with myself, I have been told I am very opinionated. I'm not always right. I'm very opinionated, and you'll know what I'm thinking. Right?
I love it.
So let me ask you now. When you're talking about training, so first answer this for yourself, and then also for your clients.
Gotcha.
What is your philosophy on determining the appropriate amount of sets and repetitions when performing exercises and training? And I realize you said that, you kind of keep things free flowing, but, and you have a rudimentary structure, but you're not necessarily tied to that. So how do you go about determining what is the appropriate amount of training?
Right. There's a lot of different schools of thought about this. And if I'm being completely honest with you, if I'm sitting down and I'm, working things out with a client or I'm hashing out a custom program for them, I'm pulling out my textbook. I've got a great book. I've just started really diving deep into overcoming gravity for like calisthenics and gymnastics style training. It's like a great handbook to have. So it's a great source of like really deep knowledge if you're looking for something for yourself and you want concrete answers about this stuff in terms of what sets and reps do I choose, even into like styles of movement patterns or how would you say it? Like, when to choose things like eccentric repetitions versus just like full concentric and eccentric, like different ways of building strength, the range of motion and different movement patterns. That's a great handbook to have. So I'd recommend that resource for anybody who's looking to do this for themselves. But when I'm doing this, first of all, it very much depends on the goals of the client, right? If they're looking to build strength and I'm determining that, they're at the right place to start layering strength on these movement patterns, like we were just talking about, then, we're working in lower rep ranges with higher amounts of weight. If we're working more towards the endurance style stuff, then, we're working with lower weights and higher rep ranges. But I think when it comes to movement practice in general, it has become a much more intuitive thing for myself. I find myself regularly talking to clients about like, okay, here's your program. Here's everything on paper. But remember that a lot of these are recommendations. I really, there's a certain point at which people are probably not ready to do this yet, but once you get to a certain understanding of your body and of movement in general, you can start to give people more freedom to play and move intuitively and listen to their body, because things change from day to day, right? Some days 3 sets of 12 repetitions of something's going to be enough. And then another day you feel like you go through 8 sets of the same number of repetitions. On top of that, let's just take animal flow to make it a bit simpler here. Animal flow movements are complex, and it's honestly very hard to put sets and repetitions on them at all. A lot of times it just comes down to, okay, have you learned the movement pattern? Has your brain figured this out, and has your body figured this out? Are you capable of doing this now? My cat's joining us now. And it really just does come down to me very frequently of how, if you're tracking progress, or if you're trying to determine if you're at the right level to move on to something else, like a more advanced variation of a movement or a posture or something like that. Ultimately, it comes down to the quality of that movement, of that posture, whatever it is, versus the quantity. Because ultimately it's a shift in mindset when you go from traditional weight training and things like that to more movement style training. It's a shift in mindset from leaning on quantity, quantifying, calculating, versus focusing on quality, on proprioception and feeling and the visual, the alignment, the angles, all of that kind of thing. So, I'll be honest, it's tough for me to answer that question. It's so dependent on the person, their goals, what it is that they're working on, where they're at in their personal journey with their physiology and their mentality. And if assuming that person is practicing movement, it becomes even more complex. I would recommend experimenting, follow basics, the basics of understanding the spectrum between strength versus endurance training muscularly. I think eccentrics are another really important one that people don't use very often. So if you're working on strength, start incorporating eccentric repetitions, or negatives as they're sometimes called. But beyond that, it's just a very complex thing. It's very dependent on the person, the context, and the situation. Yeah.
Okay. So have you ever been seriously injured since you started training in this fashion? And if so, how did you rehabilitate yourself?
Serious. There's a bit of gray area there. I have had I had a significant knee injury. This one was about 4 years ago. Can't remember exactly when though. So I never got it checked out properly, but based on what I remember and my current knowledge now, I had a minor tear in my MCL and some damage to my meniscus. I've actually, all the men in my family, naturally, we tend to have hyperextended knees. And I was just being a dumb kid, having fun. I was outside, I think it was playing football or something like that with my friends. Jumped up really high to make a catch, came down with my legs straight. My knees were probably already hyperextended before before my feet hit the ground. And when I hit the ground, my left knee, big pop, something tore. It was pretty bad. I couldn't squat for a long time. I couldn't really do anything with my lower body for a long time. I couldn't put weight on it for a couple weeks after the injury. I wouldn't say it was super serious, but it certainly set me back. I lost a lot of strength. I was doing a lot of weightlifting at the time. But I did rehabilitate myself. And one of the biggest or most helpful things that I did was actually, I think that this was by fluke, because I didn't really have this knowledge at that point, was I restored the range of motion first. It was my knee, and I had very, very limited amounts of flexion. And so I worked on restoring the range of motion first. Like I would set myself up in my room on the floor in a tabletop position, and then just try and very, very gently sink my hips back towards my heels. So, closing that angle at my knee, and just seeing if I could just get just a little bit farther every day. And then I got to the point where I felt I could sit in what's usually called hero pose. So imagine just putting your shins on the ground, tops of your feet on the ground, and kind of sitting back on your heels. I couldn't do that yet, but if I stacked 2 or 3 blocks under my hips, I could do it. And then I took a block away, and then another one. And eventually I was actually not even just sitting on my heels. I was putting my butt on the ground between my heels, probably more range of motion than you need with your knees. And that was actually right before I went for my yoga teacher training. And I continued to enhance my range of motion, my flexibility passively, for the most part. Of course, there is lots of active work in yoga, but yeah, it was it was actually not having a chair for a month while doing my yoga teacher training that really was like the last bit of that like range of motion that I had to restore in my knee. Just sitting cross-legged every single day for hours and hours on end. It was so painful, but it actually, and I was worried I was damaging it more, to be honest. I wasn't sure. My yoga teacher kept telling me, just give it love. He meant that quite literally. He said, put your hand on your knee and just tell it will be okay. It will be okay. And sure enough, about 2.5 weeks into the teacher training, my knee felt amazing. And it was feeling not just that it had that range of motion again, but I just started getting confident about doing things with my knees again that I wasn't confident about since that injury I had. And now I am actually, I think I'm more proud. This is probably a strange thing. People are going to think, what the heck is he talking about? I think I'm more proud of my knees than any other part of my body now because of that injury, my ability to rehabilitate it, and now get to a point where I really, truly feel like my knees are bulletproof, like they could almost do anything. A lot of people have discovered me on social media because they see videos of me doing dragon pistol squats, or I just call them dragon squats. And people look at that and think, your knee is not supposed to do that. Like that's not, your body's not supposed to move like that. And I try to explain, it's hard to do it in one comment, but it's actually I think the reason I probably found you is the Stable Knees name, actually, because I love it so much. And I really am very proud of my knees now. I'm so proud of the fact that I was able to rehabilitate and get way beyond where I was in terms of stability and strength in those joints. I've had some other minor injuries. That was a long spiel, so I won't go into too many other ones. Low back and some hip issues. I had posterior pelvic tilt from doing horrible deadlifts for a while, which I still work on every day today. Still work on my knees too, but has gotten much better through movement training. Other minor injuries, wrists. That's a common one. If you don't treat your wrists right and you're doing a lot of stuff with your hands on the ground, make sure you're doing wrist mobilizations, people. Elbows too, all the straight arm work, your elbows tend to get a lot of stress there. I've had a lot of minor injuries. That was probably the only major-ish one that I've had. And I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that my movement practice and all this prehabilitation work is going to keep me safe. And also just maintaining mindfulness while I practice as well is, I know, going to keep me safe. So, yeah.
Okay. Now you mentioned that you do some conventional strength training from time to time. So if you think about strength training more in a more broad sense, do you think that conventional weight training is required to develop serious strength? Or do you think that with movement-based body weight training, you can develop serious strength with that?
Well, number one, if you define serious strength as like elite powerlifter levels, maybe you're better off using weights. But if you look at elite level gymnasts, and you would agree that those guys are wicked freaking strong, then I think the answer is pretty obviously no, you don't need it. You can build incredible strength using nothing but your own body and mind. It is remarkable what you can do with no equipment. That being said, I love lifting weights. I don't do a lot of it anymore, but it's fun. It's effective. And if you do it safely with the right mindset, with the right intentions, keeping in mind some of these other things we've talked about, it's an amazing practice. I don't know why you wouldn't do it. But it's when people get pigeonholed into it that you obviously want to start opening yourself up, and any dogmatic approach to anything I try to stay away from, and I try and encourage other people to stay away from. So, it's funny because I know I've met a lot of people who are like, no, I lift weights are the most effective. This is what I do. I'm going to stick to it. And it's like, okay, do your thing. You learn your lessons and whatnot, like I did, and like a lot of people have. But I've also met lots of people, like calisthenics people, who are like, I only do body weight stuff on a parallel bar, or on a straight bar, I should say. And it's like, Well, that's just as bad. You're going to end up repeating the same movement patterns over and over again, not running into the same issues, but you're going to run into some similar ones. Just be more open in your approach to physical health. Weights in general, they're fun, they're effective, they work, but you don't need them. And I would highly, highly recommend that people learn to use their body and how to load a movement before they load a bar with weight. It's so critical. It is the absolute fundamentals of maintaining physical health, is understanding how to use this thing before you put stuff in your hands and make everything more complicated. Focus on this first, and then start incorporating equipment and additional stuff, because ultimately this is what really matters and what's going to keep you feeling good and healthy for a long period of time.
For sure. Hold on one second. Let me turn on the light here.
Take your time.
Okay. We're almost running out of time here. But let's finish up with a couple easy ones here. Cool. So what is the easiest skill that you have learned? What is the hardest skill that you have learned? And how long did it take you to learn that skill?
I'm not sure if this is quite what you're looking for, but the thing that actually pops into my mind here is meditation. I know that that's not a movement skill. It certainly applies to movement skills. But ultimately it's the skill of just being able to sit and accept what's going on. And wherever you are in your practice, and I mean this from a movement perspective, I think the most important skill is to accept where you are and enjoy wherever you are in your journey. It's an extremely challenging thing to do, but it's also extremely simple, which is why it kind of applies to both of those questions that you asked. What's the hardest and what is the easiest skill that you've learned? I'll give you a more direct answer. The hardest skill I think that I've learned, an L-sit press to handstand on my parallettes. I can't get it from the ground yet. That's the hardest one I've learned. I've been working on my hand balancing the most in my movement practice. And the easiest skill that I've learned, I have a wicked back bend, and I picked up like some people will call it a back bridge, or yogis will call it a wheel pose. I picked it up like that. I don't know why my back bends are so crazy, but that was the easiest one I learned. It just I just tried it and it was just already crazy. I don't know what it was. It's gotten better over time as I continue to practice it, but that's the easiest one, to be more direct with you. Yeah.
Okay. And the L-sit to handstand. Yeah. How long has that taken you to achieve, or how long have you been working on that?
That one has taken me a little over 2 years, and practicing from having zero hand balancing skill at all. Could not hold, it could barely hold the crow pose, let alone like an actual straight handstand. From nothing to that skill, L-sit press to handstand, with a pike press, no straddle or anything. That has taken me just over 2 years. Yeah.
That is dedication. All right. So, and this is the one thing that I think is important for people to understand. And I like the idea of getting away from numbers and gravitating more towards skill. Yeah. You really have to check your ego at the door. Right? Because you can't say to people, last week I benched 225. This week I did 235. There is none of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I've been working on my handstand. They go, well, how long? I've been working on it for 2 years, right? Yeah. And it's like, what do you mean you working on it for 2 years? I've been working on it for 2 years, right? Yeah. And I over 2 years, I've gone from a banana back to a nice hollow position.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the only thing that's changed, right?
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
Holy crap.
You know what? Little pet peeve of mine, just really quick, because I know we're wrapping up here, but a little pet peeve of mine is I often get people saying they see somebody else do something, some bodyweight skill, and they think, well, you could do that, right? You've done things that are similar. And so, you see somebody doing like a full planche, which, I'm not there yet. I got like an advanced tuck maybe. But you see somebody doing a full planche and they're like, oh, you could do that, right? And it's like, no, I'm not even close. And they're like, well, you can do the advanced tuck. Like, it's hardly any different. Like, no, you don't understand leverages and stuff. Like, that is so beyond wherever this person is or wherever I'm at. Like, oh gosh. So yeah, I appreciate that, understanding that perspective in people a lot, that the tiniest tweaks take so much practice and dedication and hard work. So yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, This has been a great conversation. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this. The timer.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Oh, not a problem at all, man. Not a problem at all. I'll probably have you back again in the future if you'd like to participate, and we'll narrow our focus at that time. But please let everybody know where they can find you, what stuff that you're doing, and how they can reach out to you if they want to. So if they want to do that.
Absolutely. So I am, of course, on Instagram. My handle across social media platforms is Evolve with Jared. My name's spelled Jared. Of course, you can find it right there. You can also find me on TikTok. I've been working on TikTok a lot and found some success there. You can find me on Facebook. I've got a Facebook group. You can find me on LinkedIn too. Look up Jared Foote is my last name, Foote. Probably best place to reach me is just send me a DM on Instagram. I answer all of my messages. I answer everything. I try and answer all of my comments as well. If you want to join one of my virtual workshops, I'd love to see you there. We're going to be starting them back up again in mid-September. If you want to join my online community on-demand training channel, that would be fantastic as well. You can find all the information about those services, one-to-one coaching as well, on my website, also evolvewithjared.com. So, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So there you have it, everybody. Once again, thank you very much, Jared, for participating with us. And, we look forward to having you here again. And I hope that it was beneficial for all you people in the audience. As always, that's been a word from Dr. Chris, not your everyday ortho. So hang tight, Jared, and we'll wrap up as soon as I sign off here.